Hello. I'm very, very pleased to be interviewing Sarah Weinman today about her fantastic book, The Real Lolita. And we're going to be, I hope, covering a wide range of topics.
I suspect there's a lot to talk about, yes.
I think there's a lot to talk about, and Sarah's going to hopefully read a little, and then we'll take questions. So let's just dive in.
Okay.
Okay, so Sarah, I would love it if you would just talk a little bit about how you started the journey of writing this book, how you got interested in the subject, what were the inciting incidents?
So it was mid to late 2013, and I had just finished doing a feature story that would be published a few months later in the New York Times Magazine. And this one was on a man who was and still is serving a life sentence for murder, who had just won a contest to write a private detective novel. And so over the last few years as a journalist and as a feature journalist, I've kind of developed this beat where crime intersects with culture, specifically 20th century culture. And I'm most interested in that time period because I feel like it's at the bounds of memory. So there are still people alive to have direct evidence and memory and knowledge of what had happened, but we're starting to lose them. They're starting to die off. What information that they have might disappear with them. It's a similar thing with information sources, that it's still kind of analog, but it's close enough to our current moment that it feels recent enough. And so there's a real challenge, at least I find, in sort of catching all of those different pieces and trying to put them together into a narrative. And as for crime, I've been kind of obsessed with crime since I was a kid. And to the point where I didn't know I was going to be a writer. It wasn't something that I thought of as growing up. I thought I was going to be first a scientist, and then I studied forensic science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice the first time that I moved to New York. And to make a very, very, very complicated and long story short, labs and I did not quite get along. I was more of a macro thinker in a micro world.
Right.
And I was much more interested in the cases and the people behind those cases, whether they be victims of crime or the perpetrators or the investigators and the like. And so all of those things, and also being a huge crime fiction reader and being immersed in that world, kind of led me along this general path. So more specifically, I just finished this story. It was late one night, and as is my wont, because I'm a child of the internet, I fell down a rabbit hole that involved some combination of specific Wikipedia pages and Reddit threads and message boards about crime. And I landed on this one essay from 2005 that was written in the Times Literary Supplement by a Nabokov scholar named Alexander Dolinin, and the piece was called What Happened to Sally Horner. And so it wasn't the first time that I'd read this piece, but it was the time that it stuck. Because in reading through it this time around and sort of being struck anew that there was this real girl who not only was an inspiration for Lolita, but her plight is directly referenced in Lolita in a parenthetical late in the novel, which goes, had I done to Dolly, Dolly being Dolores Hayes or Lolita, had I done to Dolly perhaps what Frank LaSalle, a 50-year-old mechanic, had done to 11-year-old Sally Horner in 1948. And so for those of you who have read Lolita, but even for those of you who haven't, there's so much going on in the novel. I mean, that's why there are 2 editions of the annotated Lolita. So there's so many bells and whistles that it's really easy to get distracted and lose your sense of what you're supposed to be concentrating on. And so this parenthetical, of course it makes sense that most people would have not even noticed or it whooshed by. But in having the attention drawn to it, I asked myself, had anybody reported out Sally Horner's story as a crime story? And so that's what I set out to do, first as a magazine piece, and then as this book.
And then as this book. And that's just amazing. And I of course have read a number of interviews with you in which you also talk about your relationship with Lolita prior to that. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that. I think many people have probably in this room have read Lolita.
I'm curious how many of you have read Lolita. Okay. And how many of you have not? Just to...
Yeah.
So I wrote this book so that it could be read by those who had never read Lolita or who had read it dozens of times, in part because I didn't come to it completely cold. My first time reading Lolita, I was 16, which in hindsight I think was a little young. Maybe I should have waited till college. To be fair, I was a 16-year-old who was almost about to graduate high school. I skipped a grade and then I compressed my high school. I'm originally from Canada. At that point, you do high school in 5 years, and I did it in 4. So I was getting into my senior year. And I bring this all up because Canadian literature courses are a little bit different than American literature courses. So our canon is more like Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro and Robertson Davies and Margaret Lawrence and Mordecai Richler, and these were the people I was reading and studying. And somehow in this one English class I took, we were doing One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn. And so I think in my head I thought, well, maybe I should read another Russian dissident writer, and I hear Lolita's kind of dirty, and what's going on? And so I pick it up and I start reading. And of course I still remember it was such a vivid reading experience because Humbert was my first exposure to an unreliable narrator. I just had never known that was possible. And so I felt like Lolita expanded my horizon in terms of what literature was capable of, even as of course I was disturbed, and of course I was kind of thrilled or maybe a little titillated, and feeling as if I was getting at what was going on, but not
Really?
in its full complexity.
Right.
And the, just the outrage on Dolores Hayes's behalf, that came later when I was an adult.
Later, when you reread it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's great. I was hoping that you would then tell us a little bit about as you move forward in writing the book. What are some of the highlights of your research journey? Some of the things you found out about Sally Horner and the differences between her and Lolita, and how that kind of drove you to create this very distinctive book that you've written.
So I should first preface this by saying that Sally Horner, her full name was Florence Sally Horner. Everyone called her Sally. I would later talk to relatives and ask, why was she Sally, but nobody remembered. I think it's just that was a name that stuck. So she was an 11-year-old girl in Camden, New Jersey, and her odyssey in the clutches of this man who is best known as Frank LaSalle, but as I've since sort of pieced together, he had at least 20 aliases. He was I feel like in my head he kind of emerged from the ether, in part because the first 40 years of his life were quite opaque, but it's in part because trying to figure out what his birth name was and where he was from was an exercise in banging my head against the wall. So Sally was taken on a 21-month cross-country nightmare, and it took her from Camden, New Jersey to Atlantic City, to Baltimore, to Dallas, and on to San Jose. And so I felt that it was really important to visit as many of those places as possible. I didn't get to them all in time for the book to turn in the manuscript, but I have now visited each place.
Everyone.
Yeah, I finally made it to Dallas.
Wow.
And I'm going back in a few months.
Wow.
So I do find that going to these places, even if there's not much that's left over, I find that I can have some kind of, I don't know, like a figurative connection or some sort of psychic thing happening. It's hard to explain exactly, but I guess it's an exercise in empathy.
Yeah.
That I'm putting myself in the shoes of the people that I'm writing about and trying to understand them. So for example, near the end of writing The Real Lolita, I went to Wildwood because that would figure later on in Sally Horner's life. And so I walked Wildwood's boardwalk by day and also by night to try to figure out, could I, in my head, recreate the walks that Sally probably had done in the summer of '52. So a similar thing, going to Atlantic City to see if I could find the house where she and Frank LaSalle lived. And much to my amazement, I did find that house.
Wow.
And it's still I don't want to say that it's exactly the same
Huh.
that it was, but structurally, at least from the outside, it sure looks a lot like it would have in 1948. So there was that element. From the Sally Horner parts of the book, being able to track down relatives of hers. I'm still in touch with her niece, Diana, as well as relatives of other people who played a role in Sally's rescue and later on in her life. And for the Nabokov sections, I spent a lot of time in archives. His archives are in two main places, in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and at the New York Public Library. And so most of the Lolita-related stuff is in Washington, but I found a lot of relevant information at what's called the Berg Collection, and it felt like I was flung out of time and space because at least they've changed it since then. But at the time, you couldn't bring your laptop or your cell phone,
Right.
so it was completely analog, and to just be with this material like Nabokov's letters or manuscript pages of not so much Lolita, but other books that he wrote, or the screenplay and publishing related stuff. It was just so weird and strange and kind of wonderful, but
Yeah.
I'm an archive nerd, so
Yeah.
of course I would find all of this fascinating.
Yeah. Well, what were some of the most important things that you were trying to do as you moved into this research and tried to tell the story of Sally Horner that you felt maybe that Nabokov was not doing or had not done?
I think primarily what I was trying to do is create a portrait as three-dimensional as possible of this 11-year-old girl and what she had gone through, to the best of my knowledge, because what she endured, which was sexual abuse and trauma, is also what the fictional Dolores Hayes endures. But because in Lolita we only have Humbert Humbert's perspective and narration, it's really easy to get almost seduced and manipulated into going along with his version of events. I think a lot about the Enchanted Hunters the hotel scene, which is, of course, as characterized by Humbert, the first time that their relationship is consummated, which, of
Right.
course, is
Rape.
the first time he rapes her.
Right.
But the way that he talks about it is that she instigated it, and she
Right.
brings
She's a
her.
temptress.
She's a temptress. She's not a
Right.
virgin.
Right.
And so she initiates it. And my attitude now is, why should we believe anything he says? He's unreliable. We only have his word. We don't have hers. The times when we do have her word in dialogue are in some ways the most powerful parts of Lolita. Like I think of a line, when they're on the road later on, when she's like, "You talk like a book, Dad," and I just can hear exactly what's going on. One of the things that I found in the Nabokov archives, and I wasn't the first to find it, but finding it for myself was particularly potent, was a diary entry that Nabokov's wife, Vera, wrote in both the run-up and the aftermath of publishing Lolita. So I wanted to just read that
Please, yes.
really super briefly.
That would be great.
Yeah, so Lolita, upon its American publication in 1958, was a huge success. It hit #1 on the various bestseller lists, including the New York Times. And of course, 60 years later, it still remains a perennial seller and highly controversial, and we're still talking about it, which is why I'm here. But privately, even though the public face of Vladimir Nabokov, and as perpetuated by Vera, is it's all about art for art's sake, and any real-life inspiration that would kind of cloud that narrative was something to be jettisoned and cast aside. But in this diary entry, I think Vera was kind of perturbed by a lot of the cultural reactions and the misinterpretations of Lolita. So she writes, "I wish someone would notice the tender description of the child's helplessness, her pathetic dependence upon the monstrous HH," that's Humbert, and her heart-rending courage all along, culminating in that squalid but essentially pure and healthy marriage, and her letter and her dog, and that terrible expression on her face when she had been cheated by HH out of some little pleasure that had been promised. They all missed the fact that that horrid little brat, Lolita, because there were critics who called her a horrid brat, which is
right.
just crazy.
Right.
That horrid little brat Lolita is essentially very good indeed, or she would not have straightened out after being crushed so terribly and found a decent life with poor Dick, more to her liking than the other kind. And so even though, spoiler, Dolores dies young in childbirth, it's revealed like in the first page of Lolita, so it's not really a spoiler, but in that respect there's a parallel also, because Sally Horner, even after her cross-country odyssey and her nightmare ended in San Jose, she only lived another 2.5 years.
Right.
And so she didn't get a chance to grow up. She didn't get a chance to live at a life
Right.
that could have overcome the
Right.
trauma and the abuse that she
Right.
faced and she
Right.
endured.
Right, that's one of the really amazing things about the story that you're telling. And I wondered, actually, if you do you feel that you're telling the victim's point of view or correcting for Nabokov? Would you use that language, or is that too strong, or how would you talk about it?
Yeah, I think what I want to make clear is I'm not here to replace Lolita. I don't want it to be just flung out and like baby with the bathwater here. I'm not out to castigate Nabokov, in part because I think Lolita would have existed even if he had not known of Sally's story, but because he found out about Sally's death at a really pivotal point in writing Lolita, he had been wrestling with this idea of a middle-aged man's illicit and illegal and
Right.
obsessive desire for a prepubescent girl
For a while,
from
right?
the late 20s.
Right.
So he would write, there were poems, there was a paragraph in The Gift, which is essentially the plot summary of Lolita, and of course there was this novella, Bolshevnik, or The Enchanter, which is a version of the Lolita story that was not as successful and the language isn't quite as strong, and it was not published during Nabokov's lifetime. It would eventually get published in the 80s, but it was interesting to read as a precursor and to see that he had this compulsion that he was working through, and he was not fully successful until finally that struggle culminated in this masterpiece, Lolita. So I think Lolita would have existed without Sally, but Sally's story bolstered his ability to keep going and to come up with certainly the second half of the road trip of Lolita. But at the same time, I don't want to castigate him, but I think it's important to point out Sally's story in parallel. So my hope is that what we know and learn about Sally Horner is now in permanent conversation with Lolita. I think it's much more interesting and important to complicate narratives than to replace them. So that's the side I'm on.
Absolutely, and that's so great and complex and rich. And and there is no, or the evidence, as it were, for Nabokov himself being a victim of abuse. That's sort of slim, right? Wouldn't you say? Or what is the...
So I should make clear, there's no evidence whatsoever that he himself shared Humbard's proclivities.
Right.
I've looked, biographers have looked.
Right.
I don't think there's anything there.
It was invented, right?
Or just that people can't understand this idea that you can imagine a really monstrous personality. But one way I answer it is Thomas Harris, much as he has identified with Hannibal Lecter, he's not a serial killer.
Right.
Anybody who
right.
writes a monstrous... I think this is where just dwelling in the land of crime, I can understand the imaginative leaps a little bit more readily. But we have this idea that we have to have some one-to-one binary correlation between the author and what they write.
Right.
And we don't account for their ability to imagine things and to be creative.
Right. We diminish that.
That said,
Right.
there was an instance of molestation in Nabokov's early life. But again, I think it's a much more complicated story because the relative who did that died young and left Nabokov all of his riches, which he then couldn't access because they had to flee Russia to go to Europe to flee the revolution. So I feel like there's a complicated calculus in Nabokov's head, and that then translated into the work, and maybe, but that's all I can...
Right, it's mysterious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say in the top of this book, it's more of a circumstantial case, but we build circumstantial cases all the time, and it doesn't mean they're not compelling and they're not they don't have strength.
Right.
And so I'm here to essentially reconstruct what Nabokov knew and when he knew it, in tandem with where Sally Horner was at any given point. So that's why the narrative that I ended up coming up with for my book was kind of this, almost like a double helix, I think, in a way.
Your book is mysterious, and Nabokov's book is mysterious, right? There
But
are
he's a daunting and mysterious figure,
Right.
and I still don't fully understand him, but I also feel like if Brian Boyd, who wrote the definitive 2-volume biography of Nabokov, could say more than once that even after multiple readings of Lolita, he still felt like he couldn't fully understand it, that actually gave me some hope and relief. If you who had the Nabokov's seal of approval and worked for years on these books, and you're still not getting the complexities of this particular novel, maybe I won't feel so bad.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you, of course, your book came out in September,
Yes.
right? And so this is the age of Me Too and all of that, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you see the connection or lack of connection between what you're doing and our current cultural climate.
So I had turned in the first draft of this book a year ago last September, which meant that I was editing it right when the first stories about Harvey Weinstein broke, and subsequently the great reckoning that is the Me Too movement. And so I would read these stories and get worked up and feel like, I can't be on social media anymore, I can't be reading these stories, I have to go work. And of course what I was working on is an extended story of sexual abuse and trauma, so it wasn't really much of a relief or respite. But I always felt all along, and it's both important but also sad, that Sally's story is both timeless and timely. The fact that we're still talking about Lolita 60 years later and still having arguments and still having discussions, I think also points at the timelessness and the timeliness of this novel. That said, one question that I get a lot is whether Lolita could be published today. And the way I kind of look at it is I feel like that's the wrong question to ask about it, in part because I view Lolita as such an example of post-war America, and that's the world that it's describing, and it's the world that Nabokov kind of came to love, but also to have his own complex history with. And so Lolita is so about America in 47 through 52, which is a time frame that I continue to be fascinated by, in part because there was so much societal change, and during the war women had been working and men had been off to war, and so then societal norms were supposed to reset, but nothing ever resets the way people want it to. And also, this is a time frame that I think we're supposed to feel some degree of nostalgia for, and I think that's so wrongheaded because, well, first of all, I'm just anti-nostalgia in general, but looking back at that particular history, and if we don't reckon with the darkness that lay underneath, I think we won't be able to reckon with the darkness that we're dealing with now. And so I'm much more interested, instead of being like, could Lolita be published today, it's how are people grappling with these particular narratives now, and how are they being rethought and recontextualized and reshaped. And that's also why I've been interested in various books by women that either reframe the Lolita story or even reckon with the Nabokovs themselves. There's a novel called Invitation to a Bonfire by Adrienne Selt that I really, really loved. I thought it was such an audacious work of fiction where she was trying to reimagine the Nabokov marriage, but also go off in her own different direction. And another novel, Putney, by Sofka Zinoviev, which kind of rewrites Lolita, where it starts with her young, but then we flash forward about 40 years later, she's an artist and she's trying to make art out of her experience, which she's always viewed as a consensual relationship, and as she slowly comes to realize it was anything but. So I'm continue to be fascinated by works of art that grapple with this. But I think another way I look at this too is how Lolita the novel has been adapted, and how I ultimately come down on the side that it's unadaptable, even though the films have their own charms, I suppose, or at least, they hold up in different ways.
Yeah.
But you can't take this text of Lolita
Yeah.
and put it on screen or put it in a theater or in some adaptation, because then you're sort of almost assaulted by this idea. You lose the ability to empathize with Humbert because he's right there doing all the things.
Because he becomes a monster.
He
like
becomes a
right.
monster, or
Right.
it's like, I think of this producer who worked with Stanley Kubrick on the 62 film, and he said the only way they could adapt it was to reframe it as a bizarre love story, which just makes my hackles go up, because this is not a bizarre love story. This is a story of repeated rape.
Right.
But in casting Sue Lyon, who was a little bit older, that made it more palatable.
Right.
And so
she's 16. And
yeah, she was 14 when cast, but
Right.
15, 16 when they shot it.
Right.
So
Right.
it's very different than a 12-year-old.
Of course. Yes.
And even the whole story of like, we need to play down this whole predilection for little girls. And it's
Right.
like, well, then you miss the entire point of this book.
Right. A question I was thinking about this morning as I was reading over my notes and kind of looking at what I had written in both books was whether you think in general about a kind of paradigm shift in the telling of crime stories. And I know from some of your work editing the women crime novels, Library of Congress,
Library of America,
thank you, Library of America series, that's an interest of yours. And I just, it's hard for me to not think, well, so if women are not the victims in these, like, where are we going? Like, what is the direction that we are going with these stories? If there are not male monsters.
I don't think it's an accident that there was this explosion of suspense stories by women in the wake of Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, which I also view as a very post-2008 story. It's about a toxic marriage, yes, but it's also about a toxic marriage that really it crumbles in the wake of the economic crash and the fact that Amy and Nick Dunn have to leave New York and their Tony fancy lifestyle for the Midwest, and things really just start to go catastrophically wrong. And of course it ends up being a battle of wills, kind of like a War of the Roses story. But because it was so spectacularly successful, that opened the door for writers who were already working in the suspense space and doing it brilliantly, like Megan Abbott or Laura Lippman or Sarah Grand and the like. And suddenly there were just so much more, like Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins and Tana French and so on and so forth. So it's been great to get more crime novels and crime stories by women, and commensurately I'm heartened by the number of women who are writing real crime stories. And I sort of try to pay attention to younger writers or writers working alongside me who are doing really great work, like books that I'm looking forward to by Casey Sepp, who's writing about a true crime that Harper Lee tried to write about and didn't. Rachel Monroe, who writes all these amazing long-form stories. Emma Eisenberg, Sarah Marshall, and this just off the top of my head. I know I'm missing out on so many, but just I'm so interested in the stories that women and people of color have in crime spaces, because I think too often they're dominated by white dudes, and it's good to just expand what we think of in terms of crime stories.
Right. So do you think that the victims and the perpetrators are going to be totally different moving forward into the future?
I think my friend Alice Bolin, who wrote an essay collection called Dead Girls, talks about this idea of the dead girl show. And we see it, of course, in TV, in scripted series, in Dateline television, this idea of like the beautiful white woman who's held up as some perfect victim. And it's in part, I think, our obsessive need to simplify narratives. And as I've mentioned before, I'm much more interested in complicating the narrative. So if we have more complex victims, if we have more complex perpetrators, if there's just a feeling that we can get at the larger humanity of everything, then we're all going to be better off. And it makes for maybe not ethical consumption, but just a greater understanding of what happened, that it doesn't feel as cliched, and it doesn't feel as exploitative, and it doesn't feel as binary.
Right, right. I finally wanted to ask you, there's been such an enormous response to your book.
Yeah.
Is there any one thing that has surprised you about the response?
I think what surprised me is, and this is sort of a part of a larger thing that I grapple with, is I've been heartened by the response of the people who I talked to for the book. So for example, I did an event in Philadelphia, which is just across the river from Camden, New Jersey. And the Camden of 1948 is not the Camden of now. It's a much more blighted city. Whenever I've been there, it just feels like it's suffused with sadness, and it's not a place you want to be after dark. But so I was doing an event in Philly, and Sally's niece, Diana, who was only 4 when Sally died, attended.
Wow.
And she brought her husband, and she brought her younger brother. And I had gone to visit her when finished copies of the book were ready. So it was about 3 weeks before publication. And I took the train from New York to Jersey and met with her and gave her a copy. And a few days later, she emailed to say she read it and she couldn't put it down, and she felt I had done right by Sally.
Yeah.
And so just to be able to get her opinion mattered and meant so much to me, because it's, I'm telling the story of this girl. And I think in doing so, she stands in for all girls and women then and now who have endured repeated abuse and trauma. And so Sally Horner is probably going to become an archetype. Just that's what happens when you write about somebody and they're in the pages of the book. But I also never want to forget that for Diana and for other relatives, Sally is family. And I'm writing about her to the best of my ability, but I'm also constructing a narrative. And so one of the things that I think about a lot and thought about a lot while writing it is the responsibility that an artist has to real life material. And so what do we do in terms of fictionalizing other people's pain? And so that is why it's important to have Sally Horner's narrative and her story alongside Lolita, so that we can see this real life, what's going on alongside the fiction, to kind of grapple with it. But at the same time, it's important for me as a journalist and as an author that I have to grapple similarly as well. And I do ultimately come down on the side that an artist should be free to write whatever they want. But in doing so, you have to set that bar incredibly high. And you cannot do a half-assed or mediocre job. So while I feel that Lolita succeeds as art and continues to, I think having Sally Horner's having her in permanent conversation and being reminded that she matters, and because she matters, all of us who have endured similar experiences matter. That's really what I'm after.
That's great. Thank you. I think this is a good place to take questions. Yes? Okay. Great.
Yes, we have time for a few questions. We have 2 wireless mics will be circulating. If you could raise your hands, we'll come to you. We'll start over there.
We have a question down in front. Hi. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. As a person who is a survivor of sexual abuse and also was an English major and studied Lolita over and over again, those things that Nabokov's wife was saying were not noticed were certainly noticed by me.
Yeah.
I noticed her as a victim in my reading. And my question is to you, how does it make you feel, or how do you deal with especially after you've written this book and the story of Sally Horner has been told, that Lolita as a word or as a name still is used as a shortcut for saying, you know, sexy, vampy, temptress child. And people still use it that way, and they always have. And I don't know, I cringe all the time. I was just wondering if you have a reaction when you hear that, because it's still very alive.
If I can get one thing from writing this book, it's that I hope we can finally, once and for all, divorce this idea of Lolita meaning seductress. And I think we saw this, and I know we were talking about this earlier, there had been that awful Harper's piece by John Hockenberry, the disgraced broadcaster, where in the 7,000-word screed, he then devoted several paragraphs not only to rereading Lolita, but ultimately identifying with Dolores Hayes, which was just
weird.
absolutely baffling to me.
Bizarre.
I wasn't going to read that piece, but then I got tipped off that there was
Lolita.
This, yeah, and I was like,
In it.
oh dear, I gotta
Couldn't do it, right?
yeah. And so the gall of him identifying with a victim of repeated sexual abuse is just so wrongheaded. But at the same time, I have had people come up to me and say, I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I always wondered why Lolita meant seductress, especially with the Amy Fisher case, calling her the Long Island Lolita.
Oh my God. Oh, wow.
And I think it's just every opportunity we get to look back and put things in a different context and understand, why did we do this? Why did we think this was okay? And really, this began almost as soon as Lolita was published in America. I mean, I still remember going through Nabokov's archives. They kept pretty much every clipping possible related to Lolita, whether it was reviews in multiple languages or magazine pieces, or in one case where I kind of recoiled, a photo of Zsa Zsa Gabor dressed as Lolita for a centerfold in Cosmopolitan, where she was dressed as various literary characters, including Lolita.
Wow.
So she's holding an apple and doing this whole like seductress look, and I'm just like, is this what Stanley Kubrick saw when he
Right.
was casting Sue Lyon? I mean, there's some weird concordance there. But that's one visual in terms of how Lolita was completely misconstrued and misunderstood, or just the way that comedians would crack jokes about, it's 6 years until she's legal, just things like that. So, yeah, I just hope that we remember that Lolita was a nickname given to a young girl by the man who continually defiled and raped her, as opposed to, she's some teenage temptress. There's a big difference, and we should remember that it's the former, not the latter.
Down front on the other side.
Hi. Couple link questions. First question is that Nabokov gave interview in long time ago, and he said that idea of Lolita came to him that he saw monkeys in Berlin Zoo, suggesting that he did not know the story analogous to Lolita, but it was something else. And link question to this, could we look at Lolita not as history of abuse or history of seducing by some woman, but some literature piece that more complicated than this, and cannot be as a piece to promote against rape or promote against anything, because it's not real story. It's a fiction that have some kind of meaning a little bit different than direct meaning. This is the whole point. If it will be documentary, we say, it's a monstrous situation. But Lolita not as documentary. It's some ideas of Nabokov that he find when he's been in the zoo, which is we're talking about some of very, not linear links between your ideas and what you write.
I think you'll look forward to reading my book.
We have a question over on House Right.
Okay, great.
What are your thoughts on Quilty?
Quilty.
Guilty, I'm sorry.
So with Quilty, with Claire Quilty, who of course is the man who's sort of chasing after Humbert and Dolores, and then she ultimately goes away with him, and he turns out to be equal, if not worse, to Humbert in terms of his own proclivities and deviance. There was no literal amalgam in the same way that looking at Humbert versus Frank LaSalle. So I don't deal too much with Quilty, but obviously I think the fact that Lolita, in surviving her experience with Humbert and also surviving her experience with Quilty, and then having that brief moment where she's able to fashion something resembling a normal life, that's instructive, and so that's really all I have to say in terms of Quilty.
Back here.
Hi, I think as a young woman, I just want to know, what do you think should be done on a broader scale just about the sexualization of young girls and teens? Because I know I've experienced like catcalls or different things with dress codes in public schools. So what do you think in our modern day we can do to combat this objectification and sexualization of young women?
Well, first of all, obviously I'm so sorry you experienced this, and far too many girls and women experience catcalls and harassment and all sorts of things that we just took for granted as behavior that we should accept. And I think the fact that we're not accepting this behavior, and even when there are instances where we make progress but then we have backlash, we have to continue to make progress. And so as exhausting as it probably feels like to get up every day and endure all this stuff, I think this is where finding meaning and joy is such. I do feel that it's a resistant act, a resistance, and I feel also that this is an inadequate response to a very deep question that would require many, many weeks, if not more, of grappling, because I grapple with it all the time myself, and I feel fury, and I feel anger, and I feel despair, but I also feel a lot of, joy and hope and progress, and it's not going to be a linear thing. And I think this is where looking at things from a big picture, from a historical standpoint, I find helpful for me, and that's why I often choose stories that are from the recent but still somewhat distant past, so we can see, here's how things were, here's where we are, and here's where we could be, and here are the things that we could do to make sure that we're not way back to where we were. But ultimately, it's a struggle, and I think we just have to keep finding meaning in the struggle.
Thank you.
Another one over here.
Do you think Nabokov wrote Humbert as genteel and educated for publishing reasons that would makes the book more palatable? Or do you think he was toying with the readers, getting the readers to sort of like this guy when he was really, as you say, a monster?
I mean, it was an intellectual exercise for him, and if it was palatable, then so many other publishers wouldn't have turned it down when he finished the manuscript in December of '53. He knew that this was quite literally an incendiary book. That's why he would burn pages as he wrote it. That's why he would perhaps performatively try to chuck it into the fire, but then Vera would save it on at least 2 occasions that we know of. But he always did it at a time when he knew that people would be around, whether it was Vera or a student. But the fact that there was, this was a manuscript that didn't emerge like Athena from Zeus. Like, he really struggled with it. And I think it's also important knowing this, that it makes Nabokov, who I think a lot of people view as some like grand artistic genius and a little bit of an alien, a lot more human. So, yeah, I guess that answers your question, I hope.
Other questions?
Could you comment a little bit about the influence you think that Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee has on Humbert Humbert, and the early part of Lolita when he talks about the Annabel Lee character?
Oh, there's no question that Edgar Allan Poe was a formative influence. He read Poe and Sherlock Holmes as a teen. I also found it interesting that Nabokov would be publicly disdaining of mystery fiction and crime narratives, but he was disdainful in a way that espoused deep familiarity with the genre. And I've written a piece on this that, again, a common thing with Nabokov is what he said publicly and what he said privately were, if not at direct odds, at least he would diss writers in public but have much more complicated feelings in private. And so this was someone who, I think I come back to when he would do interviews, he would send the question, you would ask that the questions be sent to him in advance, which he would then edit, and then he would write his answers down, which he would then edit, and they would all be kind of composed together and presented as if it was a spontaneous conversation. So anyone who would do that is really fascinating, because really it means that there's a lot more complex stuff happening underneath. So the fact that he loved Edgar Allan Poe and the fact that he loved Sherlock Holmes, but then he would just be like, oh, these were people I read in high school or when I was an adolescent, and thus tossed it off, or the way that he would mock and disdain Dostoevsky but also teach Crime and Punishment to his students, which I just am like, why would you teach a book that you hate over and over again? That just seems weird to me. So it's all, again, it's this idea of like narratives and what we think about are much more complicated. And obviously, you know, as you'll find in my book, I kind of address a lot of this stuff. I even bring up the influence of Alice in Wonderland, even though he never directly, I think, had a Alice in Wonderland reference in Lolita, in part because he felt it was too on the nose. It was just like, I don't feel that if I talk about Lewis Carroll, that it'll be too obvious that this is an influence. So, you know, playing games and hiding things and subverting things and manipulating the reader, these were all incredibly important in the creation of Lolita.
Good evening. I haven't read either book, yours or Lolita. Do you have an opinion on which order to read them in?
So I designed it so that you don't have to read Lolita in advance to read my book, and people who have read the Real Lolita without reading Lolita felt that it was a complete narrative experience. Obviously, I read Lolita before writing my book, so I can't divorce the two together. So I would leave it up to you. I suspect I would come down on the side of reading Lolita first, but you don't have to.
Another question over here.
I was really intrigued by the idea that you were trying to craft a narrative, but at the same time do justice to living people. And I was wondering if that ever came in conflict with one another.
I think in terms of, you know, me being alone on the page and just being like, what a audacious and weird thing that I'm doing to try to recreate and reconstruct a girl's life. And am I, you know, do I have enough information? Do I have enough source material? And also just in terms of getting people to talk to me was no small thing. I mean, I had to convince them that my faith was good, that I would try to do right by not only Sally's story, but also their story. But I also found that people wanted to share their stories. This really came up in particular when I spoke with a woman named Carol Taylor, although at the time that Sally knew her, she was Carol Starts. They were best friends in the last year of Sally's life. And it took a long time to find her, and when I found her, I just cold called and sort of crossed my fingers, and she picked up, and I explained who I was and why I was writing, and she paused and said, "You mean my friend Sally was the inspiration for Lolita?" And I sort of said, well, yeah, and then we kind of went from there. But as she told me, you know, here was this girl who she only knew for a year, but she was such a formative influence on her life in terms of teaching her essentially how to comport herself, how to be a lady, how to use a knife and fork. And so it was really interesting to learn this stuff, but it also gave me this pang of sadness because I thought, when did Sally learn this stuff? Was it before or was it on the road? And so it just goes to show that even if you experience something like what happened to Sally, this repeated abuse and kidnapping and captivity and manipulation, that you can also, there can be positive things that happen. And how do we divorce? We can't necessarily divorce one from the other. And so that's why it was important for me to tell this in as complex a way as possible, because I mistrust binary narratives. I don't think that way, and I don't want to write that way. And so if I could just convey as full of an experience and a story as I could, then I hope I've done my job.
We have time for one more question. We're coming for you.
You have one question in the middle of the house.
Thank you for this presentation. I'm curious to know if the family, the people who you spoke with, was there consciousness from the 1950s on about how the actual story of what happened was embedded in this book? Were people interviewed in any kind of national publications? Were they aware of this meta-narrative?
So if I'm interpreting your question correctly, you're wondering if Sally's family knew of the connection to Lolita?
Yes, and did they?
They learned about it when I reached out to them. They did not know. And Sally's niece didn't even know what had happened to her aunt until she was in her teens. The family did not want to discuss it. Once Sally was home, it was like omerta, it was go exactly back into the life that she had left behind. The Camden County prosecutor had advised Sally's mother that it might be a good idea for her to change her name and for them to leave Camden. They did nothing of the sort, and she went back to the same school where she was when she was spirited away, and she had a rough time of it because there was such media coverage. It was to a saturation level, and people did not conceive of her as a victim. They conceived of her as someone who had willingly given up her virginity to a much older man, and they just didn't. And so she just didn't cope terribly well until, and she was just starting to come out of it, and then her life ended in this tragic and, in just this horrible way. So, yeah, they didn't know. And there had been, as I discuss in the book, there were two instances of equating or connecting Sally's story with Lolita. One of them was this Times Literary Supplement piece I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And one, which was completely lost to time, was in an obscure men's magazine in 1963. So I think the film version kind of prompted this article to be written. And then a New York Post reporter wrote the Nabokovs asking, so what's the deal? Did you base this on Sally Horner? And Vera, writing on her husband's behalf, wrote this remarkable letter, which I reprint in the book, so you can get the gist of it there. But just this idea of it's not, there were several instances of girls that Nabokov read about, but yes, Sally Horner is referenced in Lolita, and it's but there's a cognitive dissonance there, and also her kidnapping is the only such crime that's explicitly referenced. There's one other crime that's explicitly referenced, and that's it. So what, again, it's an instance of what is being told publicly and what is happening privately or in a subterranean fashion is quite different.
That's all the time we have this afternoon. The book is on sale. The Simony Co-op table in the lobby will be setting up book signing right up front by the stage. Please, let's give our presenters another big round of applause.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you for attending.